Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of an introduction to APUSH. Today we'll cover HIP, an incredibly important part of this course, and we'll go in depth into the MCQ and FRQs, and provide some strategies for both of them. Now HIP is an acronym and stands for Historical Context, Intended Audience, Purpose, and Point of View. You may have heard of another acronym called HAPPY, which covers the same concepts as HIP does but is less common. HIP is what we can use to better understand any source that we encounter in APUSH. H stands for historical context. This means, how does the context of when the source was produced affect the stimulus itself? For example, if there was a war going on, could that have possibly changed the source compared to if it was created during peacetime? Moving on, I stands for intended audience, which is, who was the author producing the source for? This could have a large impact on how the author phrases the source. For example, if the author was writing in a diary, which is something pretty private, the source will probably be more personal and possibly be more truthful compared to if the author was giving a televised speech at the United Nations. When analyzing for this, keep in mind how the source could have varied depending on which different audiences the author could have been writing for. Next is purpose, which asks what was the source supposed to achieve. And finally is POV, which is what's the point that the source is trying to make. A tip for POV is to read the source pretending like you're the author. If you put yourself into the author's shoes, then POV may become easier to decipher. HIP will become very useful in your FRQs, as you can use HIP for tying evidence back to your thesis and strongly supporting your arguments. On your screen is what a MCQ may look like on your exam. Like this example, some MCQs can be really wordy and dense, so it's more important to make sure you correctly understand what the source is trying to say. As a reminder, the MCQ is 55 questions in 55 minutes, with each question worth 1 point, and this makes up about 40% of your exam grade. Now, the source of the stimulus will often reveal some, if not all, of HIP. Moving on, here are some tips for the MCQ. As mentioned earlier, make sure to read the information about the source before you start reading or analyzing the source itself. You can get parts of or all of HIP from the attribution, and you can get a general idea of what the stimulus is about before even reading the stimulus itself. Building on the idea of HIP, use what parts of it that you have. Analyzing the stimulus can give you a general idea of which answers are right before reading the answer choices themselves. Next, using process of elimination to remove answers can easily take your 25% chance of getting a question right to a 50% chance. Usually there is one best answer and 3 distractors, but sometimes AP can get mean and change that to 1 best answer, 1 almost right answer, which means if you change only 1 minor part, it'll be correct, and 2 distractors. If you think 2 answers are correct, be sure to look out for small differences in wording, because that will make or break the answer choice. If you have no clue, don't leave the question blank. You'll have a 25% chance of getting it right. Next, budget your time. Similar to other standardized tests like the SAT and ACT, you can only gain points. In other words, guessing on a question is better than not answering it because, again, you have a 25% chance of getting 1 point rather than a 100% chance of getting no points. And again, you have 55 minutes for 55 questions, which is approximately a minute per question. That's a pretty short period of time. So even if you have 5 minutes left and you have like 25 questions left, make sure to mark something on because you still have a chance. And finally, answer choices that reflect absolute positions are usually wrong. Not always wrong, but usually wrong. Absolute positions are phrases that reflect a 100% yes, no, or true false answer. In the case of APUSH, they could group a group into a category and place them into a position that may not be true. For example, an absolute position could be all colonists in New York City in 1754 were from France. This isn't true. Colonists came from other countries than France. Moving on, this is what questions 1 and 2 of the SAQ will look like on the test. Usually 1 stimulus is provided, but this particular question provides 2 sources and asks you to compare and contrast them. As a reminder, the SAQ is 3 questions with 3 parts in 40 minutes. The section is out of 9 points in total and is worth 20% of your exam grade. Now, if you remember from an earlier video about picking between questions 3 and 4 to answer on the test, this is what questions 3 and 4 will look like. Notice how there is no stimulus or source. This is 100% by yourself. The only difference between questions 3 and 4 will be the time periods that the questions are dealing with. Question 3 could be from Unit 3, and question 4 could be from Unit 8. Now for some SAQ tips. First, read and mark the questions before reading the stimulus if you're answering questions 1 and 2. By doing this, you can get a general idea of what the graders want before starting. Additionally, analyze the source using HIP if you can. In the question, circle time periods, subjects, and action verbs, anything that you think is important. Action verbs are the deciding factor of what College Board wants, so we'll cover that in depth in a few minutes. Next, organize your info before writing. It's easier to write with a layout in mind than covering up on the fly and wasting your time reorganizing your information. While you're writing, keep it simple. Be short and sweet, and if you use the T method, which we'll cover in depth next, then you can get the point. Hypothetically, a 2-sentence answer can get the point. Don't use bullet points though, because the graders want sentences and they will not give you the point if you use bullet points. Now this is the T method, which can also be used in the DBQ and LEQ as well, but it's more specific to the SAQ. T stands for topic sentence. Make sure to answer the question with your topic sentence, and it's okay to restate the question word for word, but make sure to take a stance at the end. Next is E, which stands for evidence. Make sure that it's accurate and will support your perspective. The sentence count doesn't matter, but remember that the SAQ should be concise, so try to aim for 3 sentences maximum. A stands for analysis. Here, explain why you use this evidence and why you think it's relevant, and tie it back to your thesis. Think of the SAQ and T method as a circle, and try and circle your analysis back to your thesis. And below is an example SAQ. Feel free to pause and read it. As you can see, this response answers the question with 3 sentences, but we could hypothetically combine the evidence and analysis sentences into 1 sentence, and this would still get the point as a 2-sentence response. Next, we'll move on to DBQs and LEQs. The prompts for the DBQ and LEQ look the same, and the only difference between the two is that the DBQ will give you stimuli and LEQs will not. On your screen is a sample LEQ. Notice how at the top, it tells you to pick 2, 3, or 4. It wants you to do 1 question and not all 3. Now here are some tips for both types of questions. They're generally the same for both, and the only differences on this slide is how to get the evidence point. We'll cover some general tips first. Before you start writing, identify what the question wants using action verbs and organize before starting, just like the SAQ, and we'll cover action verbs in the next slide, so don't worry. Again, be as specific as you can and try to use active voice over passive voice. Active voice is when the subject does an action on another object, and passive voice is when the object does an action on the subject. An active voice will strengthen your essay. The last tips are more specific to the essays. Make sure to take a position on your thesis, and that this position can be supported with historical evidence or you won't get the easiest point to earn. And you have to connect your evidence to your thesis. If you've learned in your English class essay writing time to use evidence and then connect it to your thesis with analysis, it's the same concept. To simplify, it's basically just E and A of the SAQ-T method over and over again. The process of earning the evidence point is a little different per essay. In the DBQ, use 4 or more, all docs if possible. The AP rubric doesn't say that you need all docs connected to the thesis to earn the point, but I would highly recommend to connect all of them. Because if you decide to do exactly 4 docs and then one of your docs doesn't connect that well, you might not get the point. It's better to do more rather than hoping that connecting the bare minimum will get you the points. In the LEQ, you need 4 pieces of evidence connected, not 4 sources, but 4 pieces of evidence. Like the DBQ, I'd recommend connecting all your evidence for the same reason. One of your connected evidences might not do its job so well. Complexity is the hardest point to get, so I wouldn't stress about it, but to those who really want to know, complexity is earned through using HIP to analyze your evidence really well, or explaining multiple areas effectively throughout your essay. Now for the last slide today, we'll finally be covering action verbs. These will help you a lot on your SAQ, DBQ, and LEQ on deciphering what the AP graders want for you. Feel free to pause and take a screenshot because this will influence your response. Compare, describe, and support an argument are pretty self-explanatory. When a question asks you to evaluate, you have to take a stance on the thing that you're evaluating. Trying to evaluate while maintaining a neutral position can be very difficult to accomplish. Explaining might seem pretty simple, but there are different ways of explaining, which might seem pretty weird. Explain why wants you to explain why something caused an effect. For example, you could be asked to explain why was how explain how wants you to explain how something caused an effect. For example, you could be asked how slavery was bad. And in your explaining, you could say, well, it dehumanized a lot of innocent people. An example of explaining why could be explain why the abolition movement started. Well, it started because people didn't like that others were enslaving others, so they started the movement. Identifying can become a little confusing, but think about it as what you would find in a dictionary. For example, if you were asked to identify World War I, then you could say, well, it was a war between 1914 and 1919, and it involved many countries around the world. Now, I hope this video helped a little bit. Keep these concepts in the back of your head while taking the course. And especially remember HIP, because it will become super crucial in the future. Now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.